Dr. Anthony Mumphrey on the Ernest Dutch Morial mayoralty project.
And today it'll be Connie Atkinson. It'll be I'll be starting it, and then Eric Hardy and George Winston will be part of the discussion. And right now we're getting Dr. Mumphrey to sign away all the millions of dollars we're going to make on this project. We make our big deal with PBS and reveal all.
And Dr. Mumphrey, if you could clip that mic on your lapel there. Thank you.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
And where's the other one? Who has the other one? Oh, great.
Right there.
I do. Sorry. Thank you. About what the project's about. Your name has come up all the way through this as someone that's key when we're talking to Mrs. Morial, when we're talking to the family, when we're talking to the people in the research. It was something when we've talked to people. Mainly, our emphasis has been on the first election, but where you're concerned, we want to go a little bit beyond that and talk about Dutch Morial's choosing of you and his idea of the people he got around him and the policies that his dream, his vision. So we're really talking early in the days. And I want to start out by asking a few personal things about yourself, your background, like where are you from?
Actually, I'm from New Orleans.
From New Orleans. And you went to, I think, University of Pennsylvania.
I got a bachelor and a master's degree in civil engineering from Tulane, and a PhD and a master's degree and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in regional science.
And how did you get back to New Orleans?
I had worked at UNO after I got out of the Navy in the Division of Business and Economic Research, and I had got involved with Division of Business and Economic Research because for a short time I was an MBA student, and I was a student assistant to Dr. James Bobo.
Oh, really?
And that led to eventually a full-time job at Division of Business and Economic Research. And then I decided to go away to Penn for graduate work, and became interested in the Urban Studies Institute at the time, which is now the College of Urban and Public Affairs. While I was away, I worked with Dr. Bobo on setting up actually the Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree. And then when I came back here, we went to the Board of Regents, and the degree was approved, in addition to the Master of Science in Urban Studies that they had in place at the time.
So you worked on that with Dr. Bobo. Now, what year would that have been about? What?
Well, I was...
We're not allowed to ask the ladies, but...
yeah. Well, it was probably... I was at Penn from 70 to 73, so I got out of the Navy in 68, so it was between 68 and 70 that I was a student assistant and a graduate assistant and a research assistant. That was a full-time job for Dr. Bobo. 70 to 73, I was a graduate student, and in 73 I came back here on the faculty of the Urban Studies Institute.
So, did you work at all on Dr. Bobo's report?
Yeah, we did. Before I went to Penn, we did a number of studies, mainly comparing New Orleans in a number of ways to what were then peer cities, Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston. It would be hard to argue we're still a peer of those cities now. But his major work, Pro Bono Publico, it was basically his work. I did not. I was interested in it. I knew what he was doing, but he basically did that without much of my involvement.
And where are those studies that you did with him? Do you know where they're placed? Are there copies of them?
Well, they were in the UNO library at one time.
Okay. So I'd like to find those. That'd be interesting.
I used to have copies. I don't know if I could put my hands on them now. I don't know. The Division of Business and Economic Research used to have a little library at one time. I think they did away with that.
So hopefully they send it to the UNO library.
It's probably in there. Is there a New Orleans collection or something like that
Yes,
over there?
Louisiana.
It's probably over there.
Okay.
It was. I can't remember how many we did now, but they were before he did Pro Bono Publico.
That would be interesting to see that. So what were your politics, or were you active in politics at that time? Or?
No, I. Being interested in urban affairs, one is always interested in local government and local politics. But I wasn't particularly active, or I guess you could say I was inactive before the mayor's race of 1977.
Were you involved at all in civil rights or opinions? Or
Not as a bystander only.
Yeah. Right. Interesting.
Not as in an active way.
How did you meet Dutch?
I met Dutch through Dr. Bobo. Dr. Bobo, his report had come out. It was very controversial, extremely controversial. And Dr. Bobo said that there was an underclass in New Orleans that were unemployed and underemployed, and the establishment didn't take kindly to what he was saying. But Dutch Morial, who was a judge at the time, and I guess considering running for mayor, he had run for councilman at large, probably
69.
Yeah, and had lost that race, but subsequently won as a judge. I guess he had been in the legislature before then. And so he, I guess he had been vicariously involved in city government as a judge from afar, but preparing to probably preparing to make a run for mayor. And he was a guy who was interested in many things and well read, and he read the Bobo report and somehow developed a relationship with James Bobo. One day, James called me and said, I have a fella I'd like for you to meet, and we went to lunch. And that was, I guess, in early '77 or so. And we had an interesting conversation. Dutch, or one of Dutch's political assistants, called me and asked if I would be interested in doing some policy work for him as part of the campaign, and I said yes. And in those days, every kind of organized group in the city sent out what was known as a questionnaire. What if you were elected mayor, what would you do about garbage collection? What would you do about a new bridge over the Mississippi River? What would you do about education? And I mean, every group, from the policemen's organization to neighborhood groups to political organizations, sent out what seemed like hundreds of questionnaires. And I basically coordinated the responses to these questionnaires. I guess as a consequence of answering the questionnaires, I developed policies. So in any case,
so that's early on.
This is during the campaign.
Did you run them by him before you answered them, or did he leave you to?
I'm sure he didn't look at each and every one of them. But after you do a few of them, the questions start repeating themselves, and the answers start repeating themselves. So I'm sure he reviewed the first several of them, and then after that we were just churning them out. I mean, there were many of them. When I say many, I'm not talking about 10 or 12. I'm talking about many. So eventually, he makes it into the first. He makes it through the first primary into the second primary, and wins the second primary. And I guess he saw something in me in answering these questionnaires that he appreciates. So he asked me to be director of transition between Moon Landrieu and himself. And the election was, I guess, in November, and he didn't take office until May.
So y'all had that luxury of a really long transition.
Very long transition period.
You think it's a good idea?
In some ways it was. Obviously it was uncomfortable for Mayor Landrieu, who had the next in line already chosen, making him a real lame duck. And on the other hand, Dutch was chomping at the bit to get into office. So in that way it wasn't good, in the sense that we could analyze every department, agency, board, and commission, look at their problems and opportunities, functions, and so on. That was good. And the fact that we set up these, I think we called them transition teams, that looked at the various agencies. And we had hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved, citizens, involved in analyzing government, its functions, its problems, and its opportunities. And each of these transition teams wrote generally speaking, a pretty large report. And those reports served as the model for transition teams to come afterwards. And I think those are in the New Orleans collection at the public library.
Okay. I think George was actually going to ask you about that transition era on how
Basically,
Dutch.
he basically answered it how successful it was. Transition.
I think it was very very successful. It was successful, as I said, in terms of the participation involved. It was successful in terms of when the people that actually were to run the government came into office. They had a store of information that they could use to hit the ground running, so to speak. I don't think we got any editorials from the Picayune saying how wonderful it was and what a forward-looking concept it would be. I don't think that happened.
But that hadn't happened before.
I don't think they had anything to judge by, because as you said, it hadn't happened before. Now, in the transition period, I was down here doing these things and handling day-to-day relationships with the Landrieu administration. For part of that time, Dutch went up to Harvard, to the Kennedy School, and participated in seminars and mentored students and gave some lectures and so on. Prior to that, he went to the way he became involved with the Kennedy School is periodically, at that time, Harvard used to do an institute for newly elected mayors. And he went, and they may still do it. And he went to that institute, and some of the ideas on transition came from that. And of course, one of the largest functions of transition was selecting people to participate in the administration. I mean, these transition reports were a big part of it. Day-to-day relationships with the Landrieu administration was a big part of it. but also selecting the new people to run the government. And at that time, there probably was 12. There were probably 12,000 employees that the city had, and maybe two or 300 of them were political appointees, and that's the people I'm talking about.
On the administration, so obviously had put together sort of a great team, all of whom were not politicians. So what I wanted to ask you was, how important was it to Morial to sort of introduce scholars into the fray of city government?
Well, it was substantially important, because there were quite a few that were introduced. I'm not going to be able to remember them all, but if you call me a scholar, I was one of them. Alma Young, who recently died, was a special assistant to the mayor. And then when we did the transition reports, or the activity around the transition report, actually each team had an academic associated with it that assisted the team, facilitated their activities, wrote the reports. So there was a great involvement of the academic community in the transition, and then there were certain people that were appointed to positions in city government. I named myself and Alma that I can remember now, and then people like Fritz Wagner, who eventually became the dean of the College of Urban and Public Affairs, was appointed to the City Planning Commission, ultimately serving for a number of years as the chairman of the commission. So there was quite a bit of interest in academic involvement. In fact, ultimately, Dutch created a scholar in residence program, and a woman by the name of Winona Somerville, who some of you may know, I think she's at Dillard now, was that scholar in residence, and might have even called it humanist in residence, but I'm not sure anymore. And he also created the New Orleans Center for Urban Service and Policy Research. And what that did is it took interns and placed them in city government in what was hopefully a mutually beneficial situation, that city government would benefit from what they had learned and knew, and they would benefit from the real world experience of working in city government.
Is this one of the ideas that came, you think, from the Kennedys?
I'm not sure where. It's possible. I'm not sure where Dutch got the idea from, but it was just emblematic of the relationship between the academic community and city government. And each of the college presidents or university presidents served as kind of a board of directors of this, what was called NOCUSPA, New Orleans Center for Urban Service and Policy Research. So he had an intricate and continuing relationship with the highest levels of the academic community, and it included everybody from UNO and Tulane to the Baptist Theological Seminary. All of those chief executives were involved.
Who was his most trusted colleagues, in your opinion? Who had the most access to him? Could basically had an open door policy to his office.
Well, it was probably more than one, and then he had inside advisors and he had outside advisors. And I'm not sure who all the outside advisors were, but there, he kept his finger on the pulse of the community with these some people call it kitchen cabinets. Then inside government, I would say, I certainly had access to him anytime I needed it, and Renard Rochon, who was the chief administrative officer, who is now deceased, and a guy by the name of James Chubbuck, who's also now deceased. Chubbuck was an executive assistant. I was an executive assistant, and Rochon was CAO. But getting back to selecting people for the administration, a call went out to people who would be interested in serving. Now, like I said, we had 200 positions, and we received thousands of resumes of people, because at that time, one of the paths to professional improvement in the black community was government service. And we were fortunate to get great resumes from very qualified people willing to work for a paltry salary, because it was, a way of professional improvement. I did the same thing for Mark Morial's transition, and it was easy to fill the positions in Dutch's administration. It was very difficult to fill the positions in Mark's administration, because in the 16 years that had passed, there were other paths for professional improvement in the black community. And we had white people interested too, men, women. Dutch was was an inclusive kind of a fellow. I would say, in racial lines, the administration was 50-50. He brought a lot of women into government for the first time. But we did get a lot of resumes. We got a lot of disappointed people, because there were many more resumes than there were people. And for my my section of city government, which was what do I call it? Planning and Development, I think the name of it was. I don't know what they call it anymore. Because Dutch had been at Harvard and mentoring students, and because inauguration was May 1st and the end of the school year is May, we hired, I think I hired, in this instance, about 20 people. And 10 of them were from Harvard, from the Kennedy School, and 10 of them were from urban studies. And I'm speaking roughly now. And the 10 from Harvard were good, and the 10 from urban studies were good too. So we had I had a great cadre of people involved in city government. And one of the aspects of city government that was under my auspices was economic development. And up until that time, the concept of urban economic development was being discovered, being created at that time. Historically, economic development in cities were handled by chambers of commerce, and it really wasn't a function of city government. But the federal government, after the riots in the 60s and so on, was interested in urban economic development. And those 20 people that I just discussed really participated in the creation of urban economic development and its techniques and policies. And when they went in, they basically heard the term, and that's about as much as they knew about it. And when they left 8 years later, they were experts. Unfortunately, the next administration didn't keep most of them, so that knowledge was kind of went down the drain. But I was really proud of them. They started off as basically kids and left as experts. At that time, New Orleans was comparable to Dallas and Houston and Atlanta. I mean, we had a number of Fortune 500 companies headquartered here. Probably between 5 and 10. What do we have now? One, maybe two. I had, in planning and urban development, I had a really great staff of people, and they accomplished a lot of things. They knew how to skillfully use and manage the federal programs. One of the things that we did that I'm most proud of course, was Phase 1 of the Convention Center. Perhaps this is immodest, but I don't know what the city would be if that convention center hadn't been built. We did that with a combination of federal, state, and a local contribution. Local contribution being the land. The feds put up, I think, $20 million in terms of an urban development action grant, and the state put up, I don't know, 80 million maybe. I can't remember now.
Was this land donation from the dock board? Or
No, it was actually the city owned. I don't even think the city even knew it before we got involved with the project. But as it turned out, the city owned all or a piece of, I can't remember anymore, of the land on which the first phase is built. And it wasn't from the dock board.
Well, that's sort of you segued right into a lot of the things I wanted to ask you about. Up until the Morial administration, or rather, the Morial administration was the first to develop a comprehensive economic development strategy.
To my knowledge, it was.
And it seems like the transition team and going into the first administration, you all were very keyed into what Dr. Bobo and Dr. Chai had said about the structure of New Orleans, the economic structure, the disproportionate income distribution, and low wage force participation, things like that. And I was curious to know some of the specific areas that you targeted, equity planning and things like that.
Well, one of the greatest challenges that Dutch had, and any mayor has, including up until today, is the distributional effects. And I'm not sure any mayor has dealt with them successfully. The things that we dealt with, some of them involved what I'll call efficiency, and that is the maximization of, for lack of a better term, we'll call it income. And some of the other projects dealt with equity, and that is the distributional effects. For instance, certainly the convention center would have been trickled down, so it was what I'll call an efficiency project. The Almanasta-Michoud Industrial District, which is now unfortunately labeled no bid, the New Orleans Business Industrial District.
Unfortunate acronym.
It was an efficiency project. Then we did neighborhood commercial revitalization.
Ferret Street.
Ferret Street being one, and there was one on Claiborne Avenue, and there were some other ones which I've forgotten now. Which was an equity kind of a project. Um, then we created the first Office of Minority Business Affairs, and that might have not been the name of it. And Marlon Gusman, who's now a city councilman and who was previously a CAO, I hired Marlon to run that office.
I understand that Nick Harris was also involved in it.
Nick Harris, I'm not sure if Nick was involved in that office or if he was involved in federal programs.
Okay.
I think he might have been involved in federal programs along with John Hammond. We created the first minority business goals, minority business program, and that's the difficult thing. You know, the mayor and the city can help disadvantaged businesses with city contracting, but it can't make the Whitney Bank do business with Joe Blow contracting firm. So, you know, although the political power switched from white to black in the city, the economic power has not switched, and it's still difficult to get. And I'm saying this. I'm far from it now, but it seems that, you know, it's you can't make businesses do business with each other just by mayoral edict.
Now, I had read that both Carl Stokes in Cleveland and Maynard Jackson in Atlanta had pulled city funds out of local banks in order to make them share the wealth with the black community. Now, it seems like Dutch Morial was a bit more fiscally conservative than that, and had a different climate here in the city. And I wanted to know, what was your opinion about the business climate towards the first black mayor?
Well, I think they were open to start, and as time went on, the relationship wasn't as good as it could or should have been, and was partly their fault and partly Dutch's fault, and partly the problem. You know, you just can't make people do business with each other because you want them to. You know, the law doesn't cover that in private transactions. And then you know, you get the situation where when you do try it, you know, I'm sure the business community. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about that Maynard and Carl did, but I'm sure that was not met with great applause in those two cities. Dutch, you know, he did the things that he did were as dramatic, and I'll try to think of them as we go along, but not the same. And I was, as I was going to say, mayors even run into trouble when they try to use the law for city programs, the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program. You only have to read the newspaper and look at all the investigations going on about disadvantaged business enterprise programs in the city.
Well, I was going to ask you the next thing. I understand you were involved in transportation in some sort of way, or had an interest in it. Local professor here in the faculty mentioned something about it.
I've been a consultant to the airport for a number of years.
Okay, well, I understand that the first minority business set-aside programs came out of contracts with the airport in maybe 1979 or 80. And I was curious to know about these, the set-aside programs which were used, where public money for goods and services were set aside for minority businesses.
You know, I might have been involved, or I might have had knowledge about set-aside programs, but the programs that I'm most familiar with are goals programs.
I see.
Yeah, I really don't. If they had set-aside programs, as far as I can recall, they were on paper. They, you know, if there were a few a few bids that were done, set aside for minority businesses. It's possible. I'm not
Part of
really.
your policy, or you didn't approve, that isn't something you think works?
It wasn't. I wouldn't say it didn't work. It was just not something we used. At least I used as part of city government.
How did the goals, how did that work?
Well, goals were set up for participation by minority businesses, and generally it was done through joint ventures and subcontracting between. The term minority is no longer a useful term. It's
Right.
disadvantaged. Between disadvantaged businesses, which include women as well as various kinds of minorities. And in fact, now, if you meet certain parameters, a white male can be a disadvantaged business. Unusual, but it's possible.
I was going to ask you, when you were developing policy, particularly after the or you were developing programs after the administration came in, how did the mayor make your job more difficult? Did he at some point? It seemed like he was very supportive of your expertise, and he respected expertise, obviously. And as it went on, was he always supportive, or was there something he would do that would have the works all messed up?
It was a difficult job to start off with,
Yeah.
so it wasn't an easy job. His job wasn't easy. My job wasn't easy. But we had disagreements where we would end up shouting at each other and storming out of the room and so on. But ultimately, we always reached a logical, rational conclusion and moved forward.
I was wondering how he dealt with the conflicts, because he has this reputation from afar and from the future, looking back in the past, as being very confrontational. But somehow we aren't finding that in certain areas,
Well, he was a smart fellow, and he was very challenging, and he didn't suffer fools lightly, and he also he exerted himself as the equal of everyone or anyone, and in certain quarters that didn't play well. So therein he got a combination of not suffering fools lightly. In a lot of cases, the media asked foolish questions, which the old saying, "Never pick a fight with a person that buys ink by the barrel."
Yeah, exactly.
They're always going to win. Well, he would pick fights with people who bought ink by the barrel. The foolish questions from the media and others, and his staunch belief that he was the equal of anyone else probably made some people think he was argumentative and arrogant. I didn't find him to be.
So you think when you give he respected facts, and he respected.
We had disagreements. Like we had one big disagreement about when we came into office in 1978. The average age of a bus in NOPSI, the New Orleans Public Service, which became Entergy, was running the bus system at the time, and they were trying to get out of the business, but they were still in it. The average age of a bus was something like 17 years old. And they would go down the street and it would be belching smoke, and the sides of the buses would be flapping in the wind. And so we had the opportunity to apply for some federal funds to pay for, I think it was 80% of the cost of the buses, but I can't remember now. There was a typical federal program. And I think we were going to buy, close to 200 buses. And one day I got a call from the people at the Office of Transit Administration, which ultimately became the Regional Transit Authority. But they were part of city government. And they said, there's this thing called the 13C agreement, which is some section of federal law that requires that if a transit system is municipalized and the workers become public employees, you have to agree that if there is a labor dispute, that you will enter into compulsory binding arbitration. Now, the city had a policy since the days of Landrieu and perhaps before against compulsory binding arbitration, and there had been a previous bus strike wherein an arbitrator was brought in, and the results of the arbitration, I am told, I wasn't there at the time, was very unfair. They compared, wage rates in New Orleans to wage rates in New York City, and some kind of foolishness like that. So I went to the mayor and I said, you're going to have to sign this 13C agreement saying you're going to give the bus drivers a compulsory binding arbitration. He said, I'm not going to sign that. I said, if you don't sign it, we're not going to get the buses. Well, I'm not going to violate a long-standing city policy against. I said, well, that's a big mistake. You got people standing on the street corners and the buses are breaking down. The air conditioning doesn't work. It's terrible. They're in public civic embarrassment. So he said, well, I'll call a meeting. I'll call a meeting of our cabinet. I was there, Roshan was there, Chubbuck was there, David Marcello, who was the executive counsel, was there. Probably the city attorney was there. So I walk into the meeting, and I could see the deck was stacked. There was no way that these people were going to agree that the mayor should sign the 13C agreement. So the meeting gets underway, and it becomes obvious to me that there's no way I'm going to argue these people into submission. So, within 2 or 3 minutes of the meeting beginning, I took up, I had some materials like that. I closed my materials. I turned around, said an expletive to them, walked out of the mayor's office and slammed the door. And I said, well, that was a short career in municipal government. So I was fully prepared to be fired or resign. And I think this might have been a Friday. And Saturday I went back to the office, and I was in my office doing whatever I was doing. And the mayor came in, and he had signed a 13C agreement. Which goes to show that sometimes you can act like a fool and achieve your goals, but if you act like a fool all the time, people just think you're a fool.
Yes, exactly. Good insight.
That reminds me, the idea of federal funds. Since mid-'60s, New Orleans became increasingly dependent on federal funds. And that was very nice for Moon Landrieu. But with Reagan in office, there seemed to be a little different turn during the Morial administration. And I understand that a metropolitan earnings tax was proposed and other revenue-generating sources. Could you speak on that for a minute?
Yeah, well, in fact, you're right. As I said earlier, there was probably 12,000 employees in city government at the end of the Landrieu administration. And in Mark Morial's administration was probably 5,000 employees. I don't know what they are now. A lot of them were the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, CETA, employees. There was community development funds were greater, were at their highest point in the Landrieu administration, and all of those things diminished over time. We proposed a number of fees. At that time, the implementation of the property tax was even worse than it is now. And I can't remember the statistics now, but a great number of people were paying no property tax at all. So we instituted a property use service charge of $100 per parcel. So if you were on the tax rolls as a theoretically tax-paying piece of property, you had to pay $100. And it seems to me there was more than one fee, but I can't remember what the other ones were now.
Road use fee
Yeah, what was that for per vehicle?
per vehicle.
Yeah. And were there any other ones?
There was the, it was a metropolitan earnings tax, which for non-resident employees using.
Well, we actually implemented the road use service fee and the property use service fee. And there was a revolt, and people simply didn't pay them. And I was shocked that a local reporter who I won't mention his or her name,
Giving it away.
decided not to pay it either. And which I thought it was the law, whether you liked it or not. So ultimately, the city council got cold feet, repealed the two service charges, and ultimately, I think, changed the city charter so that you couldn't enact such a service charge without a vote of the people. Then we had an earnings. This was never implemented. An earnings tax as opposed to an income tax. Because and I can't remember all the legal distinctions now, but I think income included rents and subsidies and so on, and Social Security and so on, whereas earnings just is what you made in terms of your salary. Can I get some more water? I'm losing my voice. How do you pronounce it in Alabama?
Well, just kind of water, but in New Orleans, there's a certain way of pronunciation of A's when water is concerned.
Water.
Take somebody from the rest of the South to catch it, I suppose.
So the earnings tax, as I recall, was never implemented, and ultimately state legislation was passed that outlawed that. And the property tax, and I'm not going to remember all the intricacies of this, but the property tax, when it's in terms of the administration of the property tax, and in some other cases too, when it's bad to be a parish, New Orleans is treated like a parish, and when it's bad to be a city, New Orleans is treated like a city. Normally the exemptions to the property tax only apply to parish taxes. So if you were Kenner or some other, or Lake Charles or some other municipality, if you had a municipal millage for municipal purposes, the homestead exemption didn't apply. But in New Orleans, because we were treated like a parish for those purposes, the homestead exemption applied to both municipal as well as parochial millages. So we were in a corner there. We were in a corner because we couldn't collect the earnings tax or any kind of income tax. We were in a corner because the lack of legitimate support let me rephrase it. I think support for the road use and the property service charge was legitimate, but people wouldn't do it. You know, it put the city between a rock and a hard place, which it still is in, and
As the revenues were declining for these other reasons.
as federal funds were declining, right?
So that was the impulse for, I mean, the impetus for doing these road use taxes and things was the federal funds declining.
Actually, the impetus for the things I'm talking about, or we're talking about now, is for general governmental purposes.
Self-sufficiency, you mean? City,
Yeah. You know, federal funds are great, but they're generally earmarked for very specific things. You know, you couldn't have a city employee as a fireman or as a policeman. I should say police officer or a fire person. Those monies were needed for general government. And you know, the condition of the city shows that those revenues are still needed.
Was he ever able to successfully tax the neighboring parishes to help take care of the services?
Nope.
Now, you mentioned the boards and commissions earlier. The boards and commissions, and I understand that they provided some debt relief. Sewage and Water Board could incur debt to fix drainage and sewer lines.
Yeah, well,
And it prevented the city from having to assume that.
well, a better way of saying it is the city never had the responsibility to start off with. The Sewage and Water Board is an agency separate and distinct under the law. It used to be under the Constitution from the city of New Orleans. It so happens that some of the council persons and the mayor sit on the Sewage and Water Board, and the mayor is the president of the Sewage and Water Board. But it is a corporate body unto itself with certain obligations, and to provide fresh water and to dispose of sanitary as well as runoff sewage is part of its functions. And there's a fairly clear division between if a street is rebuilt, what the Sewage and Water Board is responsible for and what the city is responsible for. And I can't recite those to you now, but it was never the city's responsibility to do those things. Certain public, the French Market Corporation, for instance, is basically a shopping center owner, and it generates revenues which can be used to do things like clean up Jackson Square and stuff like that, and maybe make certain improvements to Jackson Square. I just read the Upper Pentalba Commission is going to pay to fix the fence in Jackson Square because they're a landlord of an apartment building, and they have certain retained earnings that they acquire over time. And certain other agencies can do, like the airport, can do revenue bonds, but they can't do revenue bonds to fix city streets. They can do revenue bonds to fix the airport.
Yeah, so it actually worked as a benefit. It worked out as a benefit for the city in some ways that they had these, like the downtown development district. Residents taxing themselves to provide.
Yeah, people are not that they are inclined to tax themselves, but they are more inclined to tax themselves if they know that the money is being limited to a separate and distinct purpose. So the people in the downtown development district may agree to a millage on their property tax if they know that millage is going to result in better police protection, cleaner sidewalks, better lighting, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is a certain benefit to that.
I have more general question. I guess two parts. One is, like the thing you're saying, people are more inclined to do this. Is this some of these things that you're talking about are the problems that New Orleans has are unique to New Orleans, or were they similar problems we're having all over the world, particularly in port cities that were losing their traditional economic the
Base.
thing that produced the money, yes, like the steel mill or the port or the whatever, and they're having to change over at this time period when you were right there when all this change was happening. Do you think that there was a plan that could have fixed New Orleans, and is there still a plan that could fix New Orleans?
Well, any plan that fixes New Orleans has got to be two-pronged. First, let me talk about, the changing economy.
Which was worldwide, not just,
Right.
even though we blame our own local town always.
The Almanasta-Michoud Industrial District was conceived of as a place in which distribution and assembly and distribution would take place. It wasn't seen as a place that there would be steel mills or we wanted clean but labor-intensive industry. As we were planning that, the world economy switched, and all that kind of stuff started being done in Mexico or in Asia or other places. So the Almanasta-Michoud Industrial District was never as successful as we hoped it would be. On the other hand, New Orleans's role changed. The port became port technology, cargo handling changed, becoming much less labor intensive. The oil and gas industry declined, and much of the intellectual white collar part of that industry just left in droves. So those were bad things in an economic development sense. What replaced them was the convention and tourism business, which is not a good replacement.
Can you say why?
Because the jobs are generally low paying and unskilled. On the other hand, a job, I guess, is better than no job, and so we have some economic activity related to the convention and tourism business existing today. And what might be a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the people that fill those jobs are basically low-skilled people. You don't have to have a degree from Harvard to be a busboy. So now getting back to, and it's really shocking to me that offshore outsourcing of intellectual jobs like software development now is taking place in call centers. I don't know where it's going to end. What we're going to be left with in the United States. But the first thing, and let me just say this, in New Orleans we cannot be faulted for not having tried every economic development trick in the book. We have tried them all. Convention centers, World's Fair, gambling, aquariums, Jazzland, everything. If you go look at the International Economic Development Council and their literature, you will see that we've done everything that they talk about, and all that's done is kept us running in place. It's been good because we haven't totally dried up and disappeared. But after having been involved with those kind of things for over 20 years, and then looking at what the real problem is, unless we deal with public education, we're fooling ourselves. There's this. I'll give you one example of something I think is is ill-conceived. You hear talk about a giant international airport between
Yeah.
New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and supposedly airplanes are going to fly from somewhere and stop there, and we're going to do something to something, and they're going to fly off again to the market. Well, if you study economics, you know that one thing you want to avoid is handling of anything. So why the plane would stop in the first place is a good question that no one could answer. I mean, if there's a resource or a raw material that's unavailable any other place, then the airplane is going to stop. But if it's ubiquitous or even better in other places, then the airplane is going to go there and try to get as close to the market as possible. So, one, you have that problem, and two, if you want to have the airplane stop because of the great intellectual capabilities of the people in the airport community, then you need to build the airport 30 or 40 years from now and start dealing with public education today, so that 30 or 40 years from now you will have the people that will make it attractive for the airplane to stop in the first place.
One of the largest, I mean, during the campaign, 77.
There, up to you now.
During the 77 campaign, we noticed it in debates. Morial was talking about the interrelated problem: poverty, education, crime. These things had to be addressed. And as you said, you were writing some of the responses to these questionnaires in this literature. Where do you feel the education is a goal, improving education, but it seems to be there's a deeper problem, a deeper structural problem than just education. How do you tackle it?
Well, I mean, you're right. The problem is circular in some ways, or let's say it's deeper than just getting kids educated, because you have kids having kids, you have kids having kids, and the kids that have the kids don't provide the direction of the leadership for the kids that are going to go to school.
Now we've asked you to solve the public education problem.
First let's talk about the structural problem.
Yeah.
In fact, the mayor has nothing to do with the schools. Absolutely nothing. It is an issue in many campaigns, particularly in those days. But we made, I'm going back deep into my memory now, but we made a proposal in one of the first legislative sessions that the mayor be given an appointment to the school board. Oh, the Picayune editorialized like we had just suggested that the devil take over the world. Now this is, on the other hand, people always say, what's the mayor going to do about education? Well, when the mayor tries to get involved, it becomes, we don't want politics involved with education. Whereas, as a matter of fact, as an aside, some of the successful revamping of school systems in recent times have been when the mayor has taken over the school system. In Detroit, in Chicago, I think it was in Chicago, maybe Cleveland. But anyhow, there has been a few instances of that. As it turns out now, it's not the political thing to do, not because of what the people like the Picayune think about it. The school board now is something that's part of the African American political structure. So they don't want that removed to another level. So anyhow, there is a structural problem, and mayors are timid about inserting themselves because the claims that we're putting politics in the school board on one hand, and on the other hand, the parents of the kids in the schools and the local politics don't want to lose the power over the school board. The schools are I think, and I'm no expert on schools, but it seems that the system we have is just not working.
From top to bottom.
It's just not working.
Yeah.
You can't. And time might be right for, and I don't know who it would be, and I don't know how these people would be chosen. But to say, wait, school board, you can't run the schools right now. For various and sundry reasons, you are failing. You have failed. So we're going to take and disestablish the school board. And we're going to run it with a special master or two until we set it on its feet again. And if we get it set up straight, then we'll reinstitute the school board. That's politically unacceptable on many fronts, but practically might be the thing to do. There are educational problems with the school board. There are teacher qualifications problems with the schools. There are financial problems with the schools. And not all the financial problems is lack of money. It's the management of the money.
Is it worse now than it was when Morial was mayor?
It seems worse, but only because it's measured now.
Ah.
Because of all of the scorekeeping and the LEAP exams, and in the comparison of Orleans Parish versus everybody else. So is it worse? I don't know. But we know the dimensions of the problem now, which is in some ways good. So the schools need new educational and financial and management concepts, and I don't know how to deal with the problem of children having children. I don't know how to deal with that problem. When I was a child, everybody had a family, or most everybody had a family. The black people that I knew came from families with mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and they all lived together. And the white people did too. And somehow along the way, that concept fell apart. And so you had children not under the direction of any kind of meaningful leadership, parental guidance. And I don't know how you get that back.
So you see that, I'm sorry, but they were saying that lots of times this means that the economic structure of New Orleans is dependent upon the schools. The schools are probably dependent, a large part, maybe on a firmer social structure than we have today, which is true of most every urban area in the United States, all finding the same problems. So it seems that it means that people whose expertise is in economic regeneration and development merge onto this social psychological problems, and it seems that.
Well, as I said to start off, the problem is circular, but you got to
Circular.
intervene somewhere.
Right.
You can't do nothing.
What
So-
would you do if they brought this to you as a consultant and said, we need, well, you gather information first, I assume.
Got to gather information.
Yes.
There was a lot of work done during Mark Morial's attempt at a third term, and I don't have an instant and total recall of that. But there are a lot of interesting things being done around the country with schools
That work?
that's at least in some instances work and could be tried here. So I think we need to make the schools better. On the other hand, we need to make the economy better. Now, can you make the economy better without the schools being better? The most frustrating thing in the world is for a person to get what he or she considers to be an education and not have a job. So, you know, on the other hand, if a person has a job, it's a long goes. If a person has a job, he or she will probably have a place to live. He or she will probably have you know, a good social concept of themselves, and they will probably be responsible to any offspring that they might have. But the job's got to be there. And the job can't be a job where it's more attractive to be unemployed than to have the job, which many jobs are, going back to Bobo's time. You know, it's nobody wants to work if for just a little less they might make almost as much money and have better social services being unemployed than employed. So, I mean, you just have to do everything you can about everything, and you got to intervene in the schools. You got to try to make the economy better, and we have done that. And in a sense, coming back full circle, we did it in terms of efficiency, trying to do things that, you know, if you build a convention center, architects, engineers, contractors, planners, lawyers all get involved and make money, and then, you know, restaurants hire people to clean the tables. You provide loan and grant programs and goals programs for small businesses, you know, and maybe they get rolling. And then you know, we had an era with the schools where there, not too long ago, where it was a policy for social promotions. I mean, that can't work. It's a hoax. It's a hoax on us, the consumers of the people who are educated, and it's a hoax on the people who are educated, because they get out and they think, I have a high school degree, and they don't know how to read and write.
So what kind of sort of programs and projects did the administration work on to sort of reverse urban decay and sort of bring consumers back to New Orleans instead of going out to the suburbs to shop?
Well, we did the normal things in terms of bond programs and we did the first bond program in many years to fix the streets and the parks. We did there was a federal program which was really a great one, called the Urban Parks and Recreation Program, where we fixed up a lot of the parks. We did neighborhood commercial revitalization. One of the craziest things that happened, we proposed a penny sales tax. Mayor called the head of the school, the superintendent, and the president of the school board to his office and said, I'm going to propose a penny sales tax, and I propose that half of it go to the schools and half of it go to the city. And of course, we need to work together to get it passed. They turned him down.
Why do you think they turned him down?
I have no idea. But they turned him down.
Well, what would you say, looking back on Dutch Morial, what would you say is his greatest legacy from your involvement?
Well, his greatest legacy in an economic sense is certainly the convention center. His greatest legacy in a social sense is bringing equity to the African American community. You know, he was, Moonland, who started in that direction. Dutch certainly made, in a political sense, in a governmental sense, black people equal players, and that was a great achievement. He worked on things. The crime went down when he was mayor. As I said, we fixed up streets and parks and playgrounds. We built the convention center. It was his legacy is somewhat diminished because of the negative press and the false labels of arrogance and argumentative. that were cast on him, and the fact that he died young. You know, it would be great for him to still be around, but he died young.
He brought together an incredible group of what Dr. Hirsch called a meritorious expertise.
I think that's true.
And I think that's part of his legacy also, and you certainly were part of that.
Oh, thanks.
We really appreciate it.
Okay.
Yes. And thanks for coming. This is priceless, the interview, and I'm sure it'll be used by our students forever. UNO
Okay.
appreciates its alums coming back. Thank you.
Okay. All right.